Today's mindful moment. Ever get that feeling, when you're stuck in traffic or on a long commute, and you just wish you could use that time to learn something new? Well, what if I told you you could actually nourish your mind, even on the go?
We hear all the time about some countries just being better at economics, like they're destined to succeed while others are, I don't know, kind of doomed to struggle. But is it really that straightforward?
That's the question Eduardo Galeano really digs into in Open Veins of Latin America.
Open veins of Latin America, yeah.
He challenges that simplistic view. He argues that the wealth of some nations is actually tied directly to the struggles of others, and he uses Latin America as a case study.
Okay, so we've got this book, Open Veins of Latin America.
It's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Galeano himself even called it kind of like a pirate's tale,
Yeah.
a history of plundered riches.
Oh, wow. A pirate's tale. So we're talking centuries of resource extraction, foreign influence.
Exactly. He lays out how these external forces have shaped Latin America, often for the worse.
And we're going to try to unpack all that today. So for everybody listening, our goal here is to explore Galeano's main arguments. Really get into how the economic rise of some countries has been linked to the struggles of Latin America.
He starts with a pretty bold statement. Latin America, he says, has specialized in losing since the Europeans arrived.
Specialized in losing.
Yeah.
Okay. That's pretty stark right out of the gate.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches.
Yeah.
He makes it clear that this wasn't some kind of fair competition.
Right.
The system was built for extraction from the start. It was designed to take, not to give.
To take. And he has some pretty early examples to back that up.
Yeah.
Like, the Spanish and Portuguese, they were obsessed with gold and silver.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that's no secret. But it led to the absolute devastation of indigenous populations. I mean, you think about places like Potosi, the Antillean gold mines, the forced labor, the Mita system. It's hard to even grasp the scale of the human suffering.
There's some chilling accounts from that time. I mean, we have one historian, Fernandez de Oviedo,
Yeah.
who wrote that many indigenous people, they actually chose suicide or infanticide rather than endure the forced labor in the Antilles.
Yep.
Yeah. And centuries later, René Dumont, he observed the same kind of deep resistance to that constant toil, a resistance that was so strong, it drove some to those same tragic measures.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. And it really highlights the inherent inequality that was baked into the system from day one.
Right from the beginning. It's almost like this tragic irony. Galeano talks about Latin America's wealth, like the gold, the silver. It actually fueled its poverty.
It's exactly his point.
It's like this twisted alchemy. The gold turns into scrap metal
Yeah.
because by enriching the European empires and their local allies, that abundance actually created the conditions for underdevelopment.
It's like having all the ingredients for success, but being forced to bake someone else's cake.
Yeah. Yeah, and then having to buy the cake from them. It's this cycle of unequal exchange.
That's a great way to put it. And what's truly alarming is that this pattern hasn't gone away. It's still happening. I mean, even back in '69, Nixon, he predicted that the income gap between the U.S. and Latin America would be even bigger by the end of the century.
And was he right?
Sadly, yes, for the most part.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the gap between nations. Galeano also points out these huge disparities within Latin American countries themselves.
Right, the internal inequality.
Yeah, you have these tiny elites holding as much wealth as, huge portions of the population.
We can't talk about this without acknowledging the role of foreign powers. I mean,
No.
It goes back centuries. We're talking Spain, Portugal, of course, but then later on, the British, the Dutch, the French, they all wanted a piece of the pie.
Absolutely. It was a constant scramble for influence and resources. I mean, Spain was using the gold and silver they took to fund their wars back in Europe. And then you had the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically carved up the entire continent between Spain and Portugal.
Like it was theirs to divide up, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the Dutch, they were heavily involved in Brazilian sugar. And after the Latin American countries gained independence, British influence really took off.
It's amazing how they exerted their power in so many different ways.
Even something like the introduction of horses had a huge impact.
Horses.
Yeah, I mean, imagine you're an Inca who's never seen a horse before.
Right.
They were terrifying.
Mm.
It gave the conquistadors this massive psychological edge, like an unexpected secret weapon.
Wow. It's wild how something we might consider so ordinary could be so powerful in that context.
It really underscores the power imbalances at play.
And then Galeano dives into these cycles of exploitation. He focuses on specific commodities, each one kind of leaving its own scar.
Right.
Like, let's take sugar in Cuba.
Right.
It led to massive deforestation to create sugarcane plantations.
Right.
These cycles of boom and bust, and then, of course, growing dependence on the United States.
It's a story that repeats itself across different industries. You see intense exploitation followed by decline, and then what's left is this legacy of dependence.
And Galeano uses some vivid language to describe this. Like, he calls Trinidad, which was once this vibrant sugar producer, he calls it a resplendent corpse.
It's a haunting image, isn't it?
It is.
And the silver mines of Potosi are another perfect example. I mean, they generated incredible wealth for Spain, but the region itself ended up impoverished.
It's almost hard to believe.
There's actually this interesting detail from the 17th century where they talk about finding tin in the same area as the silver mines, but they considered it worthless back then.
Worthless?
Yeah. But today, guess what? They're extracting tin from the very waste that the Spanish left behind.
You've got to be kidding me.
Nope. And the conditions in these tin mining camps today, they're still brutal. It's a reminder that the human cost of this exploitation is still being paid.
This pattern is so disturbing.
And it continues with the Brazilian gold rush, the one in Minas Gerais. It did enrich Portugal for a while, but then much of that gold just ended up flowing to Britain.
So it wasn't even staying within the colonizing country, really.
Not entirely, no.
Wow. And it wasn't just limited to precious metals, right?
Right.
We see similar patterns with agricultural commodities like cotton in Brazil and Peru, coffee in Colombia.
Exactly.
Again, foreign capital, intense competition. Often it just stifled local industries. And the constant price fluctuations meant that any profits rarely stayed in Latin America.
For coffee specifically, President Yerras Restrepo of Colombia and Minister Levi of Brazil, they both pointed to this sharp decline in the terms of trade.
Meaning?
It meant they had to sell way more coffee just to buy the same amount of industrial goods.
Oh, I see. They were losing ground constantly.
Yeah. And Galeano goes as far as to connect the violence, the extreme violence that plagued Colombia to these struggles over coffee production.
And then we have the banana industry in Central America.
Oh, that's a particularly stark example of foreign dominance.
Yeah, these companies like United Fruit.
They had so much power. They were interfering in local politics, even orchestrating coups like what happened in Guatemala.
It's crazy how much influence these companies had.
It really shows how entire economies were set up to serve external demands. It was about meeting the needs of others, not about developing locally.
If you're interested in hearing these kinds of analyses of historical and economic themes from other books, there's this YouTube channel called Mindful Moments.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of them.
They do AI audiobook analysis. It might be up your alley.
I'll check it out.
But getting back to Galeano, it wasn't just about taking raw materials.
Right.
He also talks about this idea of industrial infanticide,
Yeah.
where basically emerging industries in Latin America were purposely held back by free trade policies imposed by powerful countries like Britain.
It's like they were being told, hey, you're free to trade, but then the rules were rigged against them.
Yeah, it's a rigged game. So it's not just about taking the resources, it's about preventing them from developing their own industries.
That's a key takeaway. I mean, think about it. While Latin American countries were being pushed towards free trade, the early industrial powers like the U.S. and England, they were using protectionist measures to shield their own industries.
They were playing by a different set of rules.
Totally. And the results were devastating. I mean, you see it in the destruction of textile mills, metalworks, all across Latin America.
Yeah.
In Mexico, Peru, Chile, Brazil.
It's like they were being set up to fail. And then we have the debt, the crushing burden of debt and dependence.
Yeah, that's another huge piece of the puzzle.
Galeano argues that all these loans, these infrastructure projects, like the railroads, they often ended up trapping Latin American economies, leading to even more debt and less control.
There's a quote by Chateaubriand that really captures this. He said that the Spanish colonies, after independence, basically became British colonies through loans. And later on, we see this phenomenon of capital flight, where more money was actually leaving the region than coming in as new investment. It's like a constant drain.
It's like you're running on a treadmill that's tilted uphill.
And then you have institutions like the IMF, the World Bank.
Yeah.
They're often portrayed as helpers, right? But they also played a big role in shaping economic policies. And sometimes those policies, they prioritized debt repayment over long-term development.
Right. It's like you're constantly having to pay back your debts, but you're not actually building anything new.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, of course, Galeano brings things into the more modern era. He looks at the rise of multinational corporations and how much control they have over key industries in places like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico.
And what's important to remember is that these corporations, they often send their profits back to their home countries. So it's still contributing to this outflow of capital from Latin America.
It's like the system is still, in many ways, set up to extract wealth from the region.
And he also introduces this concept of sub-imperialism, where you have regional powers like Brazil also engaging in these patterns of economic control. He uses Brazil's role in Paraguay as an example.
It's almost like the student becoming the teacher. And when it comes to aid, to those traditional aid programs, Galeano is deeply skeptical. He argues that their impact is often much smaller than it seems.
He even cites an OAS estimate that found that only a tiny fraction of what's called aid actually ends up benefiting the recipient countries.
So a lot of it is just, I don't know, smoke and mirrors.
He seems to think so.
Mm-hmm.
And his concerns go beyond aid. He's also worried about Latin American integration efforts.
What does he mean by that?
He thinks these attempts at regional cooperation and self-determination can be undermined by outside influence.
It's like, can you really have genuine integration when there's so much economic leverage being exerted from the outside?
Exactly. It's a question that lingers.
And Galeano ends the book on a pretty somber note.
It's a bit pessimistic.
Yeah, but maybe realistic. He echoes Bolivar's famous words, "We shall never be happy, never."
He seems to suggest that these cycles of exploitation and dependence, they're just going to keep repeating.
It's a pretty bleak outlook.
He uses the story of Maria Carolina de Jesus to really drive this point home. She was a writer in Brazil, lived in a slum in São Paulo. She briefly found fame for her writing, but then years later died in poverty. It shows how these deep inequalities, they persist.
It's a powerful reminder that things haven't really changed for so many people.
Right. And Galeano's main argument is that Latin America's underdevelopment isn't some kind of accident. It's a direct result of the development of other nations.
So as we wrap up here, I think the question we're left with is, whose progress are we really talking about, and who's paying the price?
That's the challenge Galeano throws down. He wants us to look critically at how we talk about development, to consider the long-lasting impact of exploitation. It's not just about history, it's about the reality for so many people in Latin America and in other regions today.
So for everyone listening, we really encourage you to keep thinking about these issues. Subscribe to the show if you want to hear more deep dives like this one. Share this episode with anyone who might be interested. And of course, you can always buy Open Veins of Latin America. We've got a link in the show notes.
Read it for yourself, form your own opinions.
Always think critically about the information you're getting.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.